Cohen Media Group, a reel of film unspools, erasing the logo and leaving the letter C. Preserved by Library of Congress, Packard Campus for audiovisual conservation. Cohen Film Collection. A digital restoration by Modern Video Film. Cohen Film Collection presents music composed and conducted by Carl Davis. Joseph M. Schenck presents Buster Keaton in The General, a United Artists production. Written and directed by Buster Keaton and Clyde Brookman. Adapted by Al Boasberg and Charles Smith. Photographed by Dev Jennings and Bert Hines. Technical director Fred Kabori. Lighting effects Denver Harmon. The all-white cast are Annabelle Lee, Marion Mack, Captain Anderson, Glenn Cavender, General Thatcher, Jim Farley, a Southern Gentleman, Frederick Vroom, her father, Charles Smith, her brother, Frank Barnes, 3 Union Generals, Joe Keaton, Mike Donlin and Tom Norn, Johnny Gray, Buster Keaton. Copyright by Joseph M. Schenck. This film is tinted sepia brown for daytime scenes and in blue tones for night scenes. A caption reads, "The Western and Atlantic Flyer speeding into Marietta, Georgia in the spring of 1861. In the distance, a steam locomotive pulls 5 carriages and a wagon load of wood for its firebox, passing open fields and hills covered in pine forests. Engineer Johnny Gray is at the controls, while his fireman loads the fire with wood. Johnny flicks specks of dust off the cabin side. At the front of the locomotive, its nameplate reads, General." The locomotive steams into the little town of Marietta and draws smoothly to a halt. Johnny and the fireman jump down from the cab. 2 admiring little boys are waiting to greet them. Johnny checks his watch, gives a satisfied nod, and thanks the fireman, who moses off. As he bends to inspect the wheels, one of the boys taps him and he straightens to shake their hands. Then all 3 check the wheels. Crowds of people disembark. A pair of enslaved black men bend under the weight of a huge trunk. Bonneted ladies wave their thanks to Johnny, and he waves back. A caption reads, "There were 2 loves in his life, his engine and..." A framed photograph in his cabin shows a pretty dark-haired girl. Johnny fetches his hat and jacket and slips the photograph into his jacket pocket. Outside a building with a picket fence, the girl, Annabelle, accepts a book from a woman's hand with thanks and a smile. Johnny's marching through the town with the 2 little boys in his wake. He raises his hat to a woman and the taller boy does the same. Annabelle sees them coming and sneaks in to join the rear of the line as they pass by. Johnny leads them up the path of a substantial white-painted house with a pillared porch. At the door, he buttons his jacket, wipes his shoes on the back of his trouser legs, takes off his hat, pats his hair down, and knocks on the door. Turning around, he's startled to see Annabelle behind him. He nods at her awkwardly, and she opens the door and beckons him in. The boys troop in after Johnny and make themselves at home on a little couch. Johnny sits on a bigger couch with Annabelle, but the boys' steady gaze unnerves him. He gets up, puts on his hat, and opens the door. The boys march out. He shuts the door behind them, removes his hat, puts it on a table, and returns to Annabelle. She gives him a shy smile. Johnny pulls a framed photograph from his pocket and gives it to her. It's of him with the general behind him. Annabelle puts it in pride of place on the table. In an adjoining room, Annabelle's father hears something and pulls back the curtain to peer outside. He comes out just as his son opens the front door. The young man tells him, "Fort Sumter has been fired upon." Mr. Lee replies, "Then the war is here." "Yes, Dad, and I'm going to be one of the first to enlist." The young man turns to go. Lee stops him and goes back into the adjoining room. Annabelle jumps up in alarm. Lee returns with his coat and hat. The men shake hands. Annabelle kisses them at the door and watches them go. Her face becomes grave. Johnny hasn't left the couch. She stands over him. "Aren't you going to enlist?" He gets up, flustered, and looks around for his hat. Finding it on the table, he picks it up, starts to speak, but thinks better of it, and goes to the open door. Annabelle follows. He offers his hand to shake, but she grabs him and kisses his lips. Dazed, he puts on his hat, buttons his jacket, waves dramatically, and falls off the doorstep. He scrambles up and bolts away. In the town, men are hurrying to enlist, churning up dust in the road. Mr. Lee asks for directions from a man, and he and his son stride off with him. Johnny races up behind them, but spots a shortcut down an alley and dives down it. Two men are nearly at the recruiting office, a grocery store, when Johnny hurtles out of the alley and grabs first place in line. Inside, he takes the wrong direction and bounds on top of tables to get to the recruiting counter first. The clerk looks up. "Your name?" "Johnny Gray." "Occupation?" "Engineer on the Western and Atlantic Railroad." The clerk frowns at him and goes over to a silver-haired southern gentleman for advice. The old man peers over at Johnny and says, "Don't enlist him. He's more valuable to the South as an engineer." The clerk returns to his booth, where Johnny's in an argument with a tall young man who's next in line. The clerk taps him and tells him, "We can't use you." The tall man pushes Johnny aside, but Johnny argues with the clerk. Finally, the man shoves him on his way. Johnny lingers in the shop, bewildered. The clerk enlists the tall man, giving him a slip of paper. He steps away, reading it. Behind him, Johnny eyes his height and surreptitiously measures himself against him. He barely reaches the man's shoulder. Johnny thumps his puny chest and flexes a meagre bicep. A man of a similar size walks by with his enlistment slip. Johnny stops him and asks to see it. The man shows him. Johnny sizes him up and squeezes his bicep. He looks down at the man's legs, frowns, and marches back to the enlistment booth, slipping to second in line while the others are chatting. When it's his turn, he tips his hat over his eyes to disguise himself. Without looking up, the clerk says, "Name?" "William Brown." "Occupation?" Johnny thinks. "Bartender." The silver-haired old gentleman comes into the booth to point at Johnny. The clerk reaches out and tips Johnny's hat up. He angrily gestures for him to go. Johnny moves aside, but waits. As the clerk signs another slip, he takes it while the real owner is distracted. The old man grabs him as he starts to leave, and Johnny relinquishes the slip. There's uproar at the booth as they realise the slip is missing. The old man returns it, frog marches Johnny to the door, and throws him out. Johnny shouts, "If you lose this war, don't blame me." With a resentful glare, Johnny slopes off. Outside the recruiting office, Annabelle's father and brother are still waiting in line. Seeing Johnny, they urge him to join them. He shakes his head mournfully and keeps going. Mr. Lee and his son glare at him, shake their heads in disbelief, and turn away. Johnny finds himself back at the railroad sidings and his beloved general. He sinks down on the coupling rod that joins two of the huge wheels together. He gets up but pats the back of his trousers and sits again. Annabelle's at her gate, welcoming her brother and father back home. Proudly, they show her their enlistment slips. She asks, "Did Johnny enlist?" Her brother scowls. He didn't even get in line. Annabelle's excitement fades. Her father chips in. He's a disgrace to the South. The men go into the house. Annabelle starts walking. Inside, Mr. Lee is sorting through post, tossing aside envelopes that don't interest him. He notices the photograph of Johnny on the table and hurls it after the other rubbish. Annabelle joins Johnny at the general. He jumps up when he sees her taking off his hat. "Why didn't you enlist?" she asks. He avoids her gaze. "They wouldn't take me." "Please don't lie. I don't want you to speak to me again until you are in uniform." She turns on her heel and stalks away. Johnny takes a step towards her, but stops. He sits dejectedly on the general's coupling rod and plonks his hat back on. The fireman jumps into the cab and starts the general rolling. The coupling rod rises and falls gently, taking Johnny with it, up and down, up and down. Johnny realises just as the locomotive disappears into a storage shed. A caption reads, "A year later, in a Union encampment just north of Chattanooga." A full moon beams down on the encampment of tents. A solitary sentry stands guard in the moonlight. A caption, "General Thatcher and his chief spy, Captain Anderson." The two men are sitting at a table in a tent, poring over a map. Anderson takes a puff of his fat cigar and says, "I know every railroad from Marietta to Chattanooga, and with 10 picked men, I cannot fail." General Thatcher studies the map. Anderson adds, "We will enter the South as civilians, coming from the neutral state of Kentucky to join the Southern cause." General Thatcher studies the map. Anderson adds, "We will enter the South as civilians, coming from the neutral state of Kentucky to join the Southern cause." He points out railway towns on the hand-drawn map. "At Big Shanty, we will steal the train while the passengers and crew are at dinner, and proceeding north, we will burn every bridge, cutting off the supplies of the army now facing you." He slams his hand down on the map. General Thatcher considers. He answers, "Then the day you steal the train, I will have General Parker advance to meet you." Anderson bows his head, picks up his silver-topped cane and wide-brimmed Stetson hat, and shakes hands solemnly with General Thatcher. Back in Marietta, Annabelle's brother is seeing her onto a train. He wears the grey Confederate uniform and has his arm in a sling. She reassures him, "As soon as I arrive, I will let you know how seriously Father is wounded." They glance down the train to see Johnny doing final checks. Johnny sees them too, but looks away. Annabelle's brother gives him a baleful glare. Annabelle sneaks another look at Johnny. She sighs and turns over the medal on her brother's chest, patting it gently. With his good hand, he guides her onto the train. Johnny watches them. A man in a top hat shouts the instructions to leave. Johnny takes the controls, and the general starts up. Time passes. Then the top-hatted man announces, "Big Shanty, 20 minutes for dinner." Annabelle is lost in thought, seated next to Captain Anderson. The general draws up next to a roadside eating house, and the passengers pour out for refreshments. Johnny and his firemen follow them. At last, Captain Anderson disembarks with his 10 hand-picked men. He surveys the scene. Annabelle hasn't joined the others. She searches her little bag and, not finding what she's looking for, makes her way to the baggage car. She stands on a crate to help her inside and starts to open a trunk. At the eating house, Johnny's oblivious, washing his hands in a bowl outside. One of Anderson's men quietly removes a pin that separates the passenger cars from the box cars. Anderson puts on his hat and slashes his cane down. The men run to clamber on the train. 2 find Annabelle in the baggage car. One clamps a hand over her mouth and shouts to the others. The general pulls away with its cargo. Johnny looks up from washing his hands and stares open-mouthed at the sight. He races to alert the passengers. For a moment, they're all frozen. Johnny rallies them, leading them to go after the train. They race up the tracks towards the general, but it's made good ground and is far ahead. Gradually, the passengers stop, but Johnny powers on as the train rounds a bend in the track. The train official has an idea and leads the others back. In the baggage car, 4 of Anderson's men are fighting to control Annabelle. They manage to gag her and start tying her up. Anderson is perched between the cab and the wood wagon, acting as lookout. The general slows to a stop, and the men jump out and run to a telegraph pole. In the signal box, the signal master's trying to send a Morse code message. The telegraph wires are snipped, and he's cut off. Johnny's still on his way up the track. He looks back and finds that he's all alone. There's a wooden shack nearby. He opens the door and drags out a handcart, a platform with a seesaw-like handle on top. Up ahead, Anderson's men are using axes and pickaxes to destroy the wooden sleepers and the tracks behind the train. Johnny clambers on his handcart, leaning on one side of the handle to get started, but the cart moves backwards. He gets off and pushes it forwards, jumping on and pumping the handle to get it underway. Anderson and his men have managed to rip up a section of track. They dump it on the side of the railway and climb back on the train. Johnny's got the handcart whizzing along the track. Back at Big Shanty, they've managed to muster another locomotive. It starts after the stolen general. Johnny's handcart reaches the damaged rail. It skids, throwing Johnny off, and plunges down a hill into a river. All that's left is part of the handle in Johnny's hand. He throws it into the bushes and sprints towards a bone shaker bicycle an old man has left outside his house. Johnny takes a flying leap onto it and scoots off. Anderson's taking a parcel from one of his men. Johnny pedals along a stony path on the rickety old bike and falls off. On the train, Anderson pulls on a grey Confederate coat and cap from the parcel and takes off his coat. Johnny's reached Kingston, where the Confederate army is camped. He calls out and an officer approaches. 3 men stole my general. I think they're deserters. The officer calls to his troop. They flood out of their tents. Johnny gives them instructions from his vantage point on top of a locomotive's flatbed wagon. The men swarm onto it amidst crates and sacks. Distracted, Johnny pulls out the connecting pin between the flatbed and the next car and drops it on the ground. He hops into the cab to get the locomotive going, but as it sets off, it leaves the flatbed and the soldiers behind. They disembark, but he doesn't hear their shouts. Meanwhile, Anderson gives one of his men instructions. Johnny can't see the soldiers. His view is blocked by piles of firewood in the wagon behind him. He cranes out of the cab for a better look, then pulls on the brakes and stops beside a giant mortar with its pile of cannonballs. The general has stopped to take on water from a railside tank. The men are wrecking the tracks as they go, heaving up the wooden sleepers and taking them on board for firewood. Johnny's taken something on board too, the mortar. One of the men sees Johnny's locomotive, the Texas, steaming round the corner. He drops his heavy sleeper and points, wide-eyed. Instantly, the men scramble back on the General. The water pipe is rapidly shoved aside, soaking the wood, and the train starts to move. Anderson glares down the track. Annabelle is a prisoner in the baggage car, surrounded by arguing men. Johnny keeps on going. Passing the water tank, he puts his head out of the cab. The water pipe drenches him and his firewood. He looks up at the smokestack and pokes his head out again, checking for damage. A burly man gets Anderson's attention. "Why not stop and fight them?" he asks. He draws his gun. Anderson stops him. "I'm afraid they have us greatly outnumbered." Reluctantly, the man holsters his gun and goes back to feeding the fire. Anderson glowers down the track towards Johnny. In his cab, Johnny clings to the controls, fighting panic. One of Anderson's men is hacking at their wood with an axe. Anderson takes the axe and starts chopping at the boxcar behind the wood wagon. Johnny slips out of the cab and stands on its roof to get a better view. Anderson chops a hole into the car where they're holding Annabelle, but by now, Johnny's left the cab and has climbed over to the mortar at the back of the train. Picking up a can of gunpowder, he pours some into his hand and drops it into the barrel of the mortar. He takes a second handful, considers it, and pours some back into the can, and the rest into the mortar. He stuffs a bunch of cotton wadding into the mortar's massive barrel and wedges it in with a long tamping iron. All the time, the Texas is speeding along the track with no one at the controls. Johnny heaves a heavy cannonball into the barrel and goes to the back of the mortar to set its trajectory. He lights the fuse and sprints back to the cab. Up ahead, Anderson and his men draw their guns and climb onto the roof of the boxcar. The mortar fires, the cannonball arcs through the air, landing at Johnny's feet in the cab. He gapes at it for a second, jumps down and rolls it out of the cab to the side of the track. Johnny scrambles back over the wood wagon to the mortar. While he's opening the gunpowder can, the cannonball at the side of the track explodes. Startled, he peers down the barrel of the mortar, then spots the smoke behind the train. He pours gunpowder into his hand, but changes his mind and stuffs the whole can in the mortar's barrel. He follows that with a cannonball, tamping it down hard. Then a second cannonball. He lights the fuse and starts back for the cab. His foot gets caught in the coupling that links the mortar to the wood wagon. Frantically, he shakes it free, but the mortar's left behind and the cannonballs begin to roll off. The mortar jolts, dropping the barrel inch by inch until it's pointing directly at Johnny. He scrambles hopelessly from side to side, then grabs a ladder at the back of the wood wagon and starts to climb. The mortar's fuse burns relentlessly. Johnny's foot gets tangled in a chain. He shakes it off and jumps onto the wagon, hurling a piece of wood at the mortar. On the General, the men run along the boxcar roof and throw themselves flat. Johnny runs onto the cowcatcher, a sloping grille projecting from the front of the Texas. He lies on it, below the mortar's trajectory. The Texas rounds a bend, the mortar fires, and the cannonball narrowly misses the General. Anderson and his men start an alarm, and he barks orders. A man is sent to detach the second boxcar directly in Johnny's path. Still sitting on the cowcatcher, Johnny sees it ahead and dashes back to the cab. The Texas catches up with the boxcar, its cowcatcher nudging it along. One of Anderson's men has taken an axe to the back of their remaining boxcar, splintering the wood. Johnny, still pushing the boxcar, reaches a fork in the track and lets the boxcar trundle on. He stops the Texas and changes the points, leaping back in to drive the locomotive along the second track. Quickly, he loads wood into the fire. He doesn't notice that the boxcar has rejoined his track ahead of him. When he goes back to the controls, his mouth drops open in shock. He blinks rapidly and sighs. The men have chopped a gaping hole in the boxcar on the General. They lug a heavy wooden sleeper to the hole and drop it on the track. The Texas is spitting steam into the cab. Johnny burns his hand and looks into a box, finding a top hat, a coat, and a pair of pliers. While he's trying to fix the steam problem, the boxcar ahead veers off the track and rolls onto its side in a cloud of dust. Johnny wrestles the steam valve shut and sits at the controls. He stares out of the cab, blinking slowly, bemused by the disappearance of the boxcar. Anderson's men see the Texas in the distance and rush to drop more sleepers on the track. Johnny huffs in exasperation and slows the locomotive. A sleeper is jammed in the tracks ahead. He jumps onto the track, racing ahead of the moving train, and tugs at the sleeper. It comes free, and the cowcatcher scoops him and the sleeper up. He struggles to get a precarious perch on the cowcatcher, but there's another sleeper ahead. He throws the first sleeper on the end of the second, catapulting them both off the track. Johnny clambers back to the cab. Anderson's men have reached another fork in the track. One leaps down to change the points, and they take the right-hand fork. Johnny's back in the wood wagon, collecting fuel for the Texas's fire. Anderson's men carry the bound and gagged Annabelle out of the boxcar and onto their wood wagon, where they lay her down. Johnny's collected armfuls of wood, but drops it when he realises the track ahead has been torn up. He stops the locomotive as it teeters on the end of the rails. In what remains of the General's boxcar, there's a pile of splintered wood. The men are setting fire to it. Johnny reverses the Texas at speed. He leaps out of the cab and races to change the points. Back in the cab, he starts up, but the Texas's wheels spin without gaining any traction. Johnny throws handfuls of grit from the side of the tracks under them. The Texas starts to move, picking up speed. Busy with the grit, he doesn't notice until it's past him. He dashes after it, jumping on the wood wagon and scaling the ladder to reach the cab. The fire in the General's boxcar is growing. They reach a covered bridge and drive into it, releasing the pin on the boxcar. The General emerges with its wood wagon. The burning boxcar stays inside the tunnel. Johnny's had to go back to feeding the fire. Seeing the bridge's tunnel coming up, he takes the controls, steers in, and finds himself blanketed in thick, choking smoke. The burning boxcar glides smoothly out of the bridge's tunnel, with the Texas's cowcatcher pushing from behind. Johnny continues to push it. The smoke pouring from it blows into his cab. He stands coughing, fighting for breath. Using a handkerchief to cover his mouth, he stumbles onto the wood wagon, goes to sit down, and finds himself stuck in the mouth of the engine's water tank. He struggles out, slams its lid on, and fans himself with a piece of bark. Recovered, he dashes back down the wagon. Anderson, his men, and Annabelle are all on the wood wagon. It's crowded up there. Johnny spotted another set of points. He jumps down and gallops up the track to change them. A caption reads, "The Southern Army facing Chattanooga is ordered to retreat." Two officers on horseback are in conversation. One waves his arm to order the troops to turn back. Anderson looks out of the cab and quickly orders his men to duck down. Johnny's wood store is running dangerously low. He starts chopping up the last few lengths of wood. He's too preoccupied to notice the Confederate troops and their covered wagons riding through the fields, going in the opposite direction. Infantrymen run alongside them, an entire army in retreat. He keeps on cutting the wood as the Texas steams on, blotting out the men, cannons, and horses. Still they come, wagon after wagon, careering through the bleached grass of a summer's day. Johnny rearranges the small pile of wood to get a better aim for his axe. The axe gets stuck. He struggles to free it. The last stragglers of the Confederate army pass by. Johnny has his back to them and hasn't seen a thing. But Anderson's men poke their heads up out of the wagon where they've been hiding. Johnny lugs a heavy piece of timber to the fire. A caption reads, "General Parker's victorious Northern Army advancing." A regiment of Union soldiers in their dark uniforms, shouldering rifles, marches past the Texas. They're hot on the heels of the Confederates. Busy with his wood chopping, Johnny once again fails to notice them. Cannons rattle past, pulled by teams of horses, but nothing distracts him from his work. Another regiment passes. On the general, Anderson's men whoop and cheer at the sight. Anderson realises he's still wearing a Confederate jacket and cap and hurries to take them off. Johnny takes a whack at a piece of timber and the head of the axe flies off. He looks at the handle and pokes it into the fire, then retrieves the axe head. He batters a chunk of wood with it, but it doesn't make a mark. He slings it away. Still more Union cannons trundle past. At last, Johnny sees them. He dives into the cab and hunkers down, watching the soldiers through a gap. He sinks into a daze. The general passes under a wooden bridge spanning a valley. Suddenly, Johnny springs into action, hauling on the controls of the Texas. Annabelle is still tied up in the general. It stops on top of the bridge as the Texas passes below. The men heave railway sleepers over the edge, sending them plummeting towards Johnny. One lands behind him on the wagon, startling him. He looks up. Anderson sees him. "There's only one man on that engine," he says. He shouts orders to his men. They jump down, guns drawn. Below, Johnny flusters around the cab, checking both sides, pulling on the brake. Grabbing his top hat and coat, he abandons the train and dives into the bushes at the side of the track. An overhanging branch snags his hat off. He hunts for it. It drops back onto his head. Flinging it and his coat down, he scuttles through the undergrowth, finding a hiding place among fir trees. A dark shadow passes overhead, and the heavens open with pelting rain. Johnny rests his chin on his hand, dejected. Night falls. A caption reads, "In the enemy's country, hopelessly lost, helplessly cold, and horribly hungry." Johnny bounds through the woods under a pale moonlight. The rain pours. A light comes from a window in the dark. Johnny runs up and peers in. He runs to another. Inside, a table is set with food for 5. He pushes the window up and crawls inside, soaked to the skin. The window slams. He jumps. Warily, he creeps closer to the table and helps himself to food. 5 Union officers stop outside the doorway. Johnny ducks behind the table. A servant comes in, out of the rain, with an armful of logs and drops his coat on a chair. Johnny crawls right under the table, lying across a piece of wood between the table legs. The white tablecloth hides him. The officers take their place at the table. One is General Thatcher, Anderson's accomplice. Another is Anderson himself. Clutching his stolen food, Johnny looks around helplessly. The servant clears a space so that Thatcher can unroll the map he's holding. Johnny starts to sneeze. He presses his nose to stop it. Finally, it subsides. Anderson and Thatcher study the map. Thatcher says, "At 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, our supply trains will meet and unite with General Parker's army at the Rock River Bridge." He continues, "Then the army, backed by our supply trains, will advance for a surprise attack in the rebels' left flank." Johnny lifts his head and listens keenly. Thatcher says, "Once our trains and troops cross that bridge, nothing on earth can stop us." He bangs his fist on the table. Beneath, Johnny rubs his head. An officer crosses his legs, bringing the toe of his boot dangerously close to Johnny's nose. Johnny shrinks back. Another officer burns a hole in the tablecloth with his cigar. The red-hot end touches Johnny's arm. He rubs it. Smelling smoke, the officer and another lift the tablecloth and bat the scorched area before it can catch fire. For a moment, Johnny's face is revealed beneath the table. The servant opens the front door, and a young soldier brings Annabelle in, soaked by the rain, but with a defiant expression. Anderson explains, "This girl was in the baggage car when we stole the train, so I thought it best to hold her." Thatcher questions her. She answers with her chin held high. Hearing her voice, Johnny turns his head and sees through the charred hole in the tablecloth. His eye and her face alternate. Thatcher instructs the soldier to take her into an adjoining room. She betrays her fear, twisting the ends of her lace shawl restlessly. The soldier pushes her in and locks the door. Johnny lies back under the table, pressing his fist to his lips in anguish. The officers get up from the table. Thatcher pauses to give instructions to the servant and follows the others upstairs. The servant extinguishes the ceiling lamp, bringing darkness to the room. Under the table, Johnny makes a move but stops as the servant walks by. The man hurls a pillow on the floor by the front door and shakes out a blanket. Johnny's head drops in despair. Locked in the room and sitting on a bed, Annabelle twists her shawl feverishly. Outside the window, a sentry with a rifle looks in at her. She looks back at him, and he moves on. She slumps on the bed, buries her face in her arms, and weeps. Johnny creeps silently from beneath the table and crawls into the hallway. He finds a stout stick in a wood basket and takes it with him. A sentry is in the teeming rain outside the front door. It opens, and Johnny's stick knocks him out. Johnny rolls him over and unbuttons his jacket. Annabelle's asleep on the bed. She stirs, but doesn't wake. Another sentry starts his patrol and meets Johnny disguised in a Union jacket and cap, holding a rifle. Johnny bops him on the head and he falls flat on his back. Dropping the rifle, Johnny opens the window to Annabelle's room and climbs inside. He closes the window carefully. His hand hovers over her sleeping body. He whistles softly. She doesn't move. He clamps a cold, wet hand over her mouth, and she goes rigid. Then she sees his face. He takes his hand away, holding a finger to his lips. She sits up, staring at him. He beckons her towards him, taking her hand to draw her to the window. Shushing her, he backs into a little table, knocking it over. He looks at it and at her and repeats, Shh. He opens the other window in the room, checks the coast is clear and climbs out. The window slams on his hand. Annabelle frees his hand, and he helps her climb through the window, but they both end up in the mud. Johnny grabs Annabelle's hand and pulls her into the wood. They swivel, not sure which way to go. A bolt of lightning explodes into a tree beside them, snapping off a branch and knocking Johnny down. Annabelle flees into the wood. He scrambles up. Another lightning flash sends him running. He catches up with Annabelle and tries to calm her. Another flash illuminates a bear. Annabelle bolts again. Left alone, Johnny's frightened by another lightning flash. He climbs onto a hefty tree trunk and peers through the darkness. Annabelle pops up from a bush. Johnny falls over. She helps him up and he warns her to keep quiet. She takes one step forward and stands on a bear trap. It snaps around her ankle. He pulls at it, but it doesn't budge. She tumbles to the ground, wailing with pain. Johnny frees her, but it snaps shut over his wrists. He sits down and kicks at the trap to prise himself free. His hands come free, but it snaps shut around his ankle. He grips the jaws and forces them apart. Seizing Annabelle, he pulls her up and falls flat. Annabelle realises he's not with her. A flash of lightning catches her in its glare. Johnny flies out of the bushes and pounces on her, bringing her down. He explains that they're surrounded by the enemy. He squints through the heavy rain and the moonlit bushes for signs of danger. We had better stay here until daybreak to see where we are. Annabelle touches his chest. It was so brave of you to risk your life coming into the enemy's country just to save me. She nestles her head against his shoulder. He stares into the distance, momentarily at a loss, but summons up some bluster to convince her that anyone would have done the same. She shakes her head. Kneeling beside her, Johnny wraps his arms around her and holds her as they drift off to sleep. A caption: after a nice, quiet, refreshing night's rest. Daylight, and he's still asleep, kneeling, holding Annabelle. A large pine cone drops on Johnny's head. He wakes, looks around blearily, and rubs his head. He shakes Annabelle, waking her. Trying to stand, he discovers his leg has cramped and winces. He forces it straight and massages it. Signalling to Annabelle to stay down, Johnny creeps through the undergrowth. He stands and finds himself looking at a busy Union supply encampment. Rows of tents stretch into the distance with ranks of cannons and covered wagons and men carrying sacks of provisions. He runs back to Annabelle and tells her what he's seen. Then he spots a locomotive. It's the General. An idea takes shape. He looks at Annabelle and down at the Union uniform he's wearing, stolen from the sentry. He tells Annabelle, "We've got to get back to our lines somehow and warn them of this coming attack." He sets off, skidding to a halt at a wall of sandbags. There are sacks of supplies on top, and he pulls one down and drags it, backing it into a tree. He throws his hand up in surrender, but realises his mistake. Johnny hauls the sack back to Annabelle, cuts the tie with the sentry's sword and reaches in. It's full of boots. He takes out a pair, then dumps them on the ground while Annabelle watches, her face puzzled. Johnny spreads the mouth off the sack and points to it. "Get in." She hesitates, but does what she's told, hampered by her long frilled dress. He pulls the sack up around her and pushes her head down to fit it in, but relents and kneels by her to explain his plan, to steal the general back. She nods and allows him to tie the sack up over her head. Johnny stumbles, losing his boot, and picks through every boot on the ground until he finds it. He jams it on again, nearly sitting on Annabelle. Carefully he heaves the sack over his shoulder and carries Annabelle out of the woods. Men are carrying sacks from a pile and loading them into boxcars. Johnny strolls by with his sack and follows the others, making for one of the general's boxcars. Others throw their sacks aboard, but Johnny walks past. An officer stops him and questions him. He points down the train. Wedged between two boxcars, Annabelle sneaks her hand out of the sack and steals the connecting pin. The officer orders Johnny to deposit his sack with the others. Johnny obeys, pushing Annabelle in carefully. As he turns to go, two men throw a big crate in. A barrel follows. Johnny can't look. He covers his eyes and walks away. The steady trail of boxes and crates carries on. Johnny picks up a hunk of firewood and heads for the general's wood wagon. Anderson is watching the operation. An officer is in the general's cab, checking through a book with another soldier. Johnny cracks the officer over the head, kicks two men out of the cab and seizes the controls. The officer slumps to the floor. The general chugs out of yard with just Annabelle's boxcar in tow. No one notices at first until Anderson spots one of the men Johnny kicked out. Anderson calls a lieutenant over and gives him orders. The lieutenant gathers a group of soldiers and points to another locomotive. Three officers approach Anderson. He salutes and promises, "I will get that spy before he reaches southern lines. You follow with the supply trains as planned." With a final salute, he leaves. Johnny stops the general, grabs a rope from the boxcar and throws it over a telegraph wire. One end swings back and smacks him in the nose. He loops the rope around the pole and takes one end to the boxcar, climbing the ladder to tie it firmly to a rail on top. He sprints back along the boxcar, jumps into the wagon and vaults into the cab. Johnny sets the general rolling, snatches up an axe and races back to the boxcar. The telegraph pole tilts and falls to the ground, bringing the wires with it. In the Union camp, the Morse machine stops sending. Johnny slices through the rope, dashes to the back of the boxcar and chops at its wooden wall. In the camp, another locomotive starts to give chase, and the officers give the order to get the supply train moving. Johnny's managed to cut a square hole in the boxcar. He dives headfirst through it, landing on some crates. He throws crates and barrels aside, searching for Annabelle. Unaware, he's trampling her underfoot. She sticks her head out of the sack, unimpressed. He pulls it off her. Annabelle hands him the pin she pulled out. He tosses it down and drags her to the hole in the boxcar. Johnny climbs through first and reaches for Annabelle. She tries feet first, loses her nerve, and slides over him head first. She practically sits on Johnny's head in her struggle to get to the wagon, but she won't let go of the boxcar. He grapples with her, and at last he rolls her onto the woodpile. Behind them, Anderson and his men are on the Texas, eating up miles of track. Johnny checks the controls and looks at the fire. "We must pick up more firewood," he says. He stops the general next to a wooden log fence and starts throwing the logs into the general. Each one is almost 3 meters long. Annabelle climbs on the boxcar, unties the remains off the rope on the rail, and climbs down. Johnny throws a log, which falls back out, narrowly missing him. He tries again and dislodges 3 already in the wagon, knocking them back out. He picks one up and throws it, over the wagon and onto the other side. Johnny starts to fetch it, changes his mind, runs to the cab and back for another log. Meanwhile, Anderson is giving instructions. They've reached the damaged telegraph pole. 3 men jump out and shift it off the track. Annabelle's taken the rope and is busily tying it to 2 trees, one on either side of the track. Johnny throws the last log into the wagon and hops into the cab. He looks around for Annabelle, but she's nowhere to be seen. The general begins to move. Quickly, he pulls the brake and jumps down. He finds her behind the train, securing the rope so that it's at head height. She explains what she's done. He scoffs, pulling the rope to show how loose it is. The Texas appears around a bend. They scurry back to the cab, Johnny lunging through the glassless window for the controls. They get moving, but the Texas is closing the gap fast. Men on the footrails draw their guns. Suddenly, they hit Annabelle's rope line and the trees crumple towards them, clinging to the locomotive. The trees rotate on the general's coupling rods, going up and down as the men desperately try to cast them off. The Texas has to stop to dislodge them. Johnny takes an axe to chop through the back of their boxcar. Anderson's men untangle the trees and the Texas sets off, closely followed by the supply train. They speed through the rural landscape. Johnny's still hacking at the general's boxcar wall, but not making much impression. In the general, Annabelle notices the unconscious officer lying on the floor of the cab. Johnny takes another whack, and the whole boxcar wall falls off. It lands on the track in front of the Texas, forcing it to stop. The men leap off to move it. Desperately, Johnny throws barrels and crates out of the boxcar in the Texas's path. As quickly as he does, Anderson's men clear them aside, running ahead of the Texas. In the general's cab, Annabelle's concentrating on the controls and doesn't notice the Union officer coming round. He wipes his eyes groggily and looks round at Annabelle. A beam of wood lands on his head, knocking him out again. Johnny springs into the cab and takes the officer's gun. Behind them, Anderson's men clear the last crate. Johnny lobs wood into the general's fire. He finds Anderson's Confederate cap and jacket and puts them away. They pull up next to a water tower. Johnny heaves the water pipe down, takes the lid off the general's tank, and holds the pipe over it. there's just a trickle of water. He yanks on a wire overhead. A torrent of water spurts from a shorter pipe, knocking Annabelle flat. Johnny moves his pipe over the torrent and flattens Annabelle again. She staggers to her feet and takes over the pipe. Johnny dashes back to the cab. Leaving the pipe flowing, she follows him, and they move off. He orders her to feed the fire with wood. The Texas arrives at the water tower to find a jet of water shooting into the air. It soaks Anderson and the driver in the cab. He rages at the driver. The 3 officers on the supply train behind are drenched. One ends up on his backside. They yell at the Texas. On the General, Annabelle picks up a piece of firewood with a knot hole in the centre. She rejects it, tossing it off the train. Johnny stares incredulously. Anderson calls a soldier over and hands him a connecting pin. He tells the man to go to the front of the locomotive and use it. Annabelle's finished with the fire and is looking for something else to do. She picks up a broom and daintily sweeps the cabin. Johnny's split between driving and keeping his eyes on the Texas behind them. Men are stationed on the footrails at the sides. He notices the broom and snatches it from her, shouting that she should be feeding the fire. Annabelle picks up a thin stick and pokes it into the flames. He gets down and hands her a splinter of wood. Dutifully, she adds that to the fire. Johnny grabs her by the neck, shakes her, and kisses her. He goes back to the controls, leaving her baffled. The General hurtles through the countryside, but the Texas is only meters behind them and gaining fast. Men are sitting on the cowcatcher at the front, one with a connecting pin in his hand. The Texas puts on speed until the cowcatcher is nudging the General's tail. A rod is attached, the pin is thrust into place, and the men race aboard through the boxcar. Johnny yanks out the pin at the other end, casting the boxcar adrift, and scoots back to the cab. Angry faces appear at the hole in the boxcar wall, and the men take aim with their rifles. Johnny pulls Annabelle down, holding her tight. The men fire and miss. Standing at the cowcatcher of the Texas, Anderson calls them back to change a signal point. The boxcar coasts off up one fork. The Texas reverses to take the other. It collides with their supply train behind, sending the officers tumbling again. They stand to brush themselves down, yelling at the Texas as it takes off. The supply train jolts as it starts up, and down they go again. In the General's cab, Johnny instructs Annabelle on the controls. He leaps to the ground and attaches a chain on the back of the wagon to the rails. He signals Annabelle to start the locomotive. The rail buckles. But Annabelle's forgotten how to stop the locomotive. She shouts frantically to Johnny, pulling at every control she can lay her hands on. He charges after her. The General has taken the level side off the rail. The other side goes uphill. The General disappears round a corner. Johnny stops and looks to the side of the track. The ground falls away in a steep hill. He tears down it. Annabelle pulls desperately at the controls. Ahead of her, Johnny slithers down the last few meters of the hill, just as she manages to stop the General. By putting it in reverse, Johnny starts back up the hill. The 2 armed soldiers are standing on top of the Texas's cowcatcher, scanning the distance for a sign of the General. The General's reversed back to the top of the hill. Johnny's just sped down. He reaches the top and springs onto the front of the General, making his way to the cab. He stops the General just after the place where the tracks forked. The Texas and the supply train zoom onto the uphill track, and find it stopped short. They brake rapidly. The Texas's cowcatcher hangs over a 4-metre drop, the men dangling from it perilously. Johnny steams off while he has a chance. Anderson's men crawl back to safety, and the 2 locomotives reverse down the hill. A soldier goes to change the points and discovers the chain and the buckled section of track. He warns the Texas not to advance, and they examine it. Ahead, Johnny hands the controls over to Annabelle and loads a beam of wood into the fire. He gets out of the cab and hurries to the front. Once there, he opens a panel, takes an oil lamp from the headlamp aperture and carries it back. A caption reads, "The Rock River Bridge." The slender wooden bridge spans a tranquil river between pine tree-covered banks. The general drives onto it, but stops at the far end. Johnny carries the smoking beam of wood from the fire to the wagon. Annabelle passes chunks of wood down to him, and he piles them onto the tracks. Anderson and his men are still scrutinising the buckled track. The 3 officers get involved. 2 rock the points, trapping the other's hand between the rails. Soldiers free him. He flies backwards, knocking his colleagues down. The pile of firewood on the bridge has grown. Annabelle throws Johnny the tiniest piece of wood. He hurls her tiny offering back at her. A caption, "The Northern Division nearing the bridge to meet the supply trains." 2 cavalry units travel up a rough woodland road with ranks of rifle-carrying soldiers behind. Teams of horses pull cannons. On the bridge, Johnny fetches the oil lamp and throws the glass chimney away. He pours the oil over the pile of wood. Annabelle watches him from the wagon, the smouldering beam of wood resting beside her. She goes to throw him another piece of wood and knocks the beam onto the rail. Flames shoot up, trapping Johnny behind them. He jettisons the oil lamp and dithers, driven back by the heat and the smoke. Annabelle calls down to him, telling him she's going back to the cab. She moves the locomotive as Johnny nerves himself and takes a flying leap over the pile. He plunges straight through a gap in the bridge and into the river below. Johnny strikes out for the bank. He gets out and begins a soggy climb back up to the general. Annabelle fine-tunes the position of the locomotive so that he can swing himself directly into the cab. 3 of Anderson's men are trying to break the chain on the tracks with a beam, but only succeed in landing face down in the dirt. At last, the general's speeding along. Annabelle's keeping a lookout while Johnny handles the controls. Up ahead, a Confederate sentry is on patrol. Johnny calls to him, and seeing his Union clothes, the sentry shoots. Johnny grabs Annabelle to protect her. He's at a loss. She points out his clothes. She helps him change his jacket and cap for the Confederate version Anderson left behind. Confederate soldiers in a small town run up to greet the general. Johnny wastes no time warning them of the danger, and they race to prepare. The silver-haired Southern gentleman, now in a Confederate general's uniform, runs out of a building marked Divisional Headquarters. Johnny jumps from the wagon. He explains the situation, pointing towards the bridge. The general gives orders to his officers. They scatter. Annabelle arrives to back Johnny up. A bugler sounds the alarm at the Confederate camp, and there's a flurry of soldiers rushing up from the town and streaming from the tents. Line after line of horses stand waiting to be harnessed. An aide brings the general's hat and sword. Annabel and Johnny help him prepare. Johnny doesn't stop talking as he buckles the old man's sword on. The whole camp is ready and dashing to pick up their rifles. Johnny and Annabel help the general to mount his horse. His officers ride up behind him with a Confederate flag, and he gallops off at the head of his division, cavalry, infantry, and cannons raising clouds of dust. Johnny and Annabel are stranded in the middle of the main street as the division charges by. The townsfolk wave their boys off. Just as it seems all over, another avalanche of men and horses thunder past. Johnny pulls Annabel to the side of the street and explains his plan. But she's seen her wounded father sitting in the garden of a house. She runs to his open arms. Johnny takes a step back and is nearly mown down by another horse. He looks around, aggrieved, and steps into the street, making a brisk about turn as more horse gallop by. Annabel looks up, searching for Johnny. He's stock still in the road as the last soldiers go by. There's nothing left but a few bits of debris in the dirt. He sees a battered sword still on a belt, picks it up and puts it on. He sheathes the long sword with a heroic gesture and starts forward. It trips him up. He gets up and tries again, successfully. Anderson's locomotive driver has released the chain. Telling the others to stand back, he smacks the back of his axe against the rail and drives it into place. He jams the axe against it to keep it there. Without a backward glance, he trudges back to the Texas. Anderson orders them back on the train. A thick plume of dark smoke is rising from the Rock River Bridge. A Union brigade approaches and halts at the site. The Brigadier General signals his men to advance, and cavalry and infantry race up a wide track in the woods. They arrive at the blazing bridge at the same time as the Texas. The locomotive stops and the men get off. The Union Brigadier General rides up with two officers. Anderson indicates to fire. Men and horses try to ford the river. They're forced back by the gunfire and retreat. He tells Anderson, "That bridge is not burnt enough to stop you, and my men will ford the river." He rides off. Anderson gives his orders and they rejoin the train. The brigade rides down the steep riverbank. The Texas begins to cross the bridge. It reaches the fire. The bridge crumbles beneath it. It plummets into the river, taking Anderson and his men with it. The Brigadier General meets the accusing eyes of his subordinates. Subdued, he draws his sword to signal them on. The Union Army surges down the riverbank. Unseen by them, high up on the opposite bank, Confederate sharpshooters creep into place. Others set up a battery of cannons. The Confederate general signals, "Fire!" The Union soldiers are sitting ducks, faced with a fusillade of bullets and cannonballs from an elevated position. They can't escape. Men and horses try to ford the river. They're driven back by the never-ending gunfire and retreat back up the riverbank. Some try to retaliate from the remains of the bridge. Gunsmoke drifts over the river. punctuated by explosions as cannonballs meet their target. More Confederate troops emerge from a line of trees. The Union cavalry is in full retreat, whipping their horses back across the river. Up on a high ridge, Johnny's with the general. He's talking to another cavalryman. Johnny's watching the battle below. The general draws his sword. Johnny copies him, and the handle comes away in his grip. Turning his sheath upside down, he slides the blade out and fixes the handle back on. Another soldier comes up for orders, trying to resheath his sword. Johnny misses his sheath and jabs the blade into the soldiers behind. He turns on Johnny. The general dismisses him. Johnny sees the general wave his sword to give orders, takes his out and points it towards the cannons. They fire, taking half a tree down and sending the Union brigade on the run. Johnny returns to the general, who points his sword. Johnny does the same, and the blade falls off. He snatches it up and reattaches it. The line of Confederate cannons continue the barrage, splintering more trees. Johnny indicates another target. He adds his voice to the general's, sweeping his sword, but the blade flies off. Johnny trots over to the cannons, but a cannonball misses him by a whisker. The soldiers use a tamping iron on the barrel of a cannon, with Johnny giving unwanted directions. They don't see a Union sniper close by, loading his rifle. He shoots and hits one of the cannon team. Another bullet goes in the breech. Johnny pinpoints a target for a second soldier. Another shot. The man falls. Johnny and the third soldier look at his dead comrades. Carefully, Johnny comes forward and shows him the target. And the man falls, dead. Johnny peers around for the sniper, but turns his attention to another cannon team. The sniper loads another bullet. With a sweep of his sword, Johnny yells, "Fire!" His blade flies off and spears the sniper in the back, killing him. Johnny studies the handle of his sword. He gives up and throws it away. A group of Union soldiers are hiding among rocks at the edge of the river. Johnny sees them and yanks on a cannon's firing cord. Nothing happens. He has another try. The barrel jerks upwards and shoots into the sky. His gaze follows the cannonball. He runs. It crashes into a dam, releasing a rolling flood that cascades down the river. The water reaches the Union soldiers and sweeps them away. Johnny runs to another cannon team, still checking the sky for the cannonball. He shows them the supply train stranded on the other side of the river. Their cannonball just falls short of hitting it. The officers on board reel with shock. Behind them, the Union army is fleeing from the battle. The supply train reverses. A cannonball hits the last boxcar. The driver and fireman run, with the 3 officers close behind. On a rocky outcrop, a Confederate waves the flag and takes a bullet in the chest. Johnny swipes it before it can fall and holds it aloft. He stands on a Confederate officer hiding among the rocks, who throws him off and gives him a sharp reprimand. A caption: Heroes of the Day. The victorious Confederates return to the town, with folks lining their way to cheer. Johnny marches at the front, beside the general, who's on horseback. More townsfolk cheer and wave as they arrive in the main street. Johnny moves aside to allow the military to accept their applause. He stumbles against the back of a locomotive and sits down heavily. He looks round at the locomotive, recognizing it. It's his general. Johnny rises and walks to its side. He brushes some dust off its frame and gets into the cab. Behind him, the unconscious Union officer comes round. It's General Thatcher. He massages his head and turns to see Johnny. Johnny half collapses at the sight of him. He stares closely at Thatcher and peeps out of the cab, but Thatcher's alone. Johnny helps him to his feet and draws his pistol. He shows it to Thatcher and jerks his head, signalling him to get off. Thatcher takes a step forward and Johnny stiffens, then invites him to go first. He gives a jaunty little twirl of his gun as he follows Thatcher. Thatcher puts on his hat and Johnny brushes down his uniform. The Confederate general comes out of his office. Johnny and his prisoner walk side by side to meet him. Annabelle's with her father. He gapes at Johnny. The two generals salute each other. General Thatcher takes out his sword. Johnny's gun goes off. Thatcher glares and he holsters it hurriedly. Thatcher formally surrenders his sword, presenting it handle first to the older general. He lays it on a table. He introduces his captain, who marches Thatcher away. Johnny admires Thatcher's sword, comparing it to his. The general frowns at him, and he stands to attention. The general plucks at Johnny's sleeve. "Is that your uniform?" he asks. Johnny shakes his head. "I had to wear it to get through the lines." "Take it off." Johnny obeys, removing his sword. The general whispers to his aide, and the man goes back to the office. Johnny unbuttons his jacket, while Annabelle and her father watch anxiously. Johnny takes off his jacket and holds it out. The general snatches it. Johnny dejectedly removes his cap. The aide returns and takes the discarded clothes. He gives the general a coat, which he throws to Johnny. Head hanging, Johnny puts it on. The general gives him a wide-brimmed Stetson hat. Baffled, Johnny looks down at the coat with its double row of brass buttons and dark lieutenant's cuffs. He stares at the general. "Really?" The old man nods. Johnny puts on his hat and buttons his jacket. Annabelle's father urges her to go over. She beams. The general presents Johnny with Thatcher's sword. With a look of disbelief, he accepts it and sheathes it. Annabelle runs up. He poses proudly, chin high. The general commands, "Enlist the lieutenant." His aide, the clerk from the enlisting office, asks, "Occupation?" Johnny draws himself up. "Soldier." He takes Annabelle in his arms and, with a glance at the aide, leads her away. He sits her on his beloved general's coupling rod and holds her close. A soldier comes out of the camp and salutes him just as his lips meet Annabelle's. He returns the salute and resumes the kiss. Another soldier, another salute. A third soldier. Johnny and Annabelle part reluctantly. Johnny returns the salute irritably. He takes her in his arms, only to see the entire camp emerging from their tents and coming their way. Johnny moves Annabelle along the rod and sits on the other side. As the men file past, each salute. Johnny's right arm keeps saluting like a metronome, but he gets Annabelle's kiss. A caption reads, "The End." Audio description written by Roz Chalmers, voiced by Elaine, Lillian, Joseph.